Hello, Degrassi fans, and welcome to the Degrassi Kid podcast. I'd like to say that this was my idea, but actually, Annie Clark from Degrassi told me I should start a podcast. So, of course, I was like, okay, all right, sure. For this very first episode, I'm excited to take this time to experiment and get into the groove of podcast making. And I wanted to start with a topic that's very easy to talk about and one that we're all really excited for, which is the new Degrassi Reboot. Now, my vision for this podcast isn't necessarily to do episode recaps. I think we already have quite a few wonderful, talented folks who do that very, very well in the Degrassi community. And instead, I want to focus on the overall impact of Degrassi. I want to look at how Degrassi tackled abortion over 3 different generations. I want to talk about how Emma and Caitlin are literally the exact same character and how Degrassi uses these generational parallels to tell the same stories over and over again. And I want to look at how Degrassi changed storytelling for young people through television by introducing trans characters, by casting age appropriate, and by always making sure the story is told from the teen perspective. So today, we'll go through what we know about the reboot, the checklist of what it needs to be truly considered Degrassi, and talk about what the reboot can do to be even better than any Degrassi that's come before it. So for now, let's just sit back, get comfy in this new podcast space, and talk a little bit about the new Degrassi Reboot on our very first episode of the Degrassi Kid podcast. So before we dive in, let's quickly get caught up on the history of Degrassi and how we got here to a reboot announcement in the year 2023. Degrassi started back in 1979 with the Kids of Degrassi Street, and it was 26 episodes that were made over the course of 7 years, and it was basically just like a trial run for Degrassi. The Kids of Degrassi Street mostly focused on elementary school kids and was very much an after-school Special 5, even more so than the episodes we see today. They tackled stories about your first visit to the hospital, misguided adventures in babysitting, and the values of telling the truth. And Degrassi's whole history was based on providing education through film to kids. The creator, Linda Schuyler, was a junior high school teacher who felt there just wasn't any media for her students to see themselves in. So she went ahead and made Degrassi. Then from 1987 to 1991, they made Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High collectively, which was a much more polished version of the show and really cemented some core values that we still see today. And of course, we'll go through those later when we dive into the what Degrassi needs to be Degrassi checklist. But this period of time is often collectively referred to as the Degrassi Classic Series. And they wrapped up that series with a movie in 1992 called Degrassi Schools Out. They also created a real-life series called Degrassi Talks, where the Degrassi actors interviewed real high school students about topics they covered in the show, like the realities of drug use and sex and alcohol. Now, some big Degrassi classic moments included 13-year-old Spike getting pregnant, Erica having an abortion, the straight male character Dwayne testing HIV positive, and we're introduced to memorable characters like Lucy and Caitlin, or Snake, Joey, and Wheels, who make up the Zit Remedy. Everybody wants something. But then we flash forward to 2001, and Degrassi's head writer Yan Moore started to think, hey, wouldn't Spike's baby be old enough to start junior high right about now? And from that one single idea, Degrassi The Next Generation was born, with Emma Nelson as one of their leading characters, a series that would literally go on to last for 14 seasons and then produce another spinoff. But one of the biggest additions to that new production was Linda Schuyler's husband, Stephen Stone. He was an entertainment lawyer who joined Degrassi as a co-executive producer. And together, they owned a production company called Epitome Pictures, Inc., which also made shows like the LA Complex and Instant Star and their very own Riverdale spinoff. And a huge change happened to Degrassi during the 13th season. Epitome Pictures sold Degrassi to a new production company called DHX Media. And if you've ever wondered why there's no DVD sets for season 13 and 14 of Degrassi, it's because this change left it up in the air as to who had the rights to distribute the physical media. And they've just still never resolved it, and we're just apparently never getting them. But DHX Media produced Degrassi Season 14, but most notably, they brought us into the latest installment of Degrassi Next Class from 2015 to 2017, bringing us into the streaming service Netflix. Now, they tackled stories like non-binary characters, depression, they introduced Syrian refugee students, and they very much stayed true to reflecting the real high school experience at the time. And then it just stopped. There were no new episodes being made, and nobody really knew what was going on. And there was no official announcement of an official cancellation. The Degrassi fan community was just kind of left waiting in this weird limbo of hopelessness. That was until 5 years later, on a very random Thursday afternoon in January 2022, an announcement was made. A new series simply titled Degrassi was going to start production. It was finally here. It was like we were all ready and on board for Degrassi to come back. Of course, like we're 100% behind the show. But at this point, there was just no hope left in us. It was like they disappeared and then, oh, now we're back. We're here again. You know what I mean? So I want to go through it. Let's break down what we know about the new series. The American streaming service HBO Max reached out to DHX Media and ordered 10 one-hour-long episodes of new Degrassi content. It's the same as when Linda and Steven would make the episodes at Epitome Pictures Inc. and then Teen Nick or Much Music would then air the episodes. And to make sure we're fully caught up, during Degrassi Next Class, DHX Media started a subsidiary company called Wild Brain. And it was all about family-friendly programming, including Degrassi. So DHX Media owns Wild Brain, and Wild Brain owns Degrassi. And I hope that's the only boring thing I have to share with you today. But anyway, let's just get caught up on what's happened so far and what's actually interesting. After Degrassi was quote-unquote canceled, the entire series was uploaded to YouTube and completely free to watch. And it's still available in Canada and some other countries. But in terms of American fans, the episodes were taken down and moved to HBO Max. They even removed the Degrassi Classic episodes, but HBO Max has not started streaming them, and we don't know why, we don't know if they're coming back, we don't really know what's going on there. And that's a problem, because for the first time ever, there's not a lot of transparency in decisions that are being made around Degrassi. Steven Stone, for example, used to keep us updated on Twitter over everything, and that's why I know about the production rights around DVD releases, for example. And of course, I want to mention that Degrassi Next Class is still streaming on Netflix, and there's other streaming sites like Tubi and Pluto TV where you can watch Degrassi for free, but this change was just very jarring to the Degrassi community, considering what we're used to in terms of communication. And in terms of who's running the show, Linda Schuyler and Steven Stone will not be executive producing the series, which it makes total sense as they completely passed the torch back in 2013 when they sold Degrassi the first time. Though they do put their full support behind new showrunners Lara Azzopardi and Julia Cohen, who are working on the new Degrassi series together. And what's interesting is that Lara and Julia previously worked on Degrassi The Next Generation together. They co-wrote a Season 8 episode titled Heat of the Moment, and Degrassi fans will mostly remember that as the I Hate Holly J episode, when Allie makes a face rage page to bully Holly J to the point, well, people are telling Holly J to go unalive herself in very creative ways. Now, if you look at Julia's IMDb page, she's mostly known for producing shows like A Million Little Things and Riverdale, and she's also produced a short film called Rewind that starred Stacey Farber, or as we may know her, the lovable Ellie Nash. While Lara's IMDb page shows that she's mostly known for producing shows like Backstage and Mary Kills People. But an interesting find was that she was also a writer on the LA Complex. And to me, that's very important because, as I mentioned before, the LA Complex was produced by Linda and Steven. And Linda and Steven are two people who have set a certain expectation around their shows in terms of realistic storytelling done in a safe, respectful, and responsible way. And I want to point out that the LA Complex was created around the same time season 12 of Degrassi was being made, even using some of the same sets. The set of the LA Complex becomes the Hollingsworth Pool and Mansion later on, for example. And some Degrassi actors star in the LA Complex as well. Cassie Steele, who played the very notable Manny Santos as one of the main characters, and Dio Ade, who played BLT back in the Degrassi Classic series. So with all of Julia and Lara's experience, especially connected to Degrassi, it just makes me feel like the new Degrassi reboot will really be in good and safe hands. We also know for sure that the new Degrassi will be set in Toronto and hiring Canadian actors across the country, which is a really big deal because HBO Max is an American streaming service, and it's not been officially announced if there's a Canadian streaming service that Degrassi will air on, though it likely will be Crave. But that's not been 100% confirmed, which has kind of rubbed some of the fans the wrong way, including myself. It's a Canadian series, and us Canadians can't even get a confirmation on if we can watch it. And I think that's a problem. Ultimately, though, the production company is Canadian, the writers are Canadian, the actors are Canadian, it's filmed in Canada, so I think we'll be okay in terms of the production still having that Canadian feel to it. And no official character descriptions have been announced, but the audition sides were posted, and they both mentioned COVID and had swear words in it. Dun, dun, dun. Degrassi's only ever had one F-bomb in the history of the show, and it was this big moment in the 1992 Schools Out movie, and don't worry because I'm going to set the stage for you. Joey Jeremiah and Caitlin Ryan have been in an on-again, off-again relationship for like the entirety of the Degrassi Classic series, and you'll remember them. They come back as adults in the Degrassi The Next Generation reboot, but back at their own graduation party, Joey Jeremiah pops the big question, and Caitlin's like, oh my god, this is too much, and they enter another weird limbo of dating, not dating. And at this time, Joey meets Tessa Campanelli, who, he sleeps with her all summer long, even after he officially gets back together with Caitlin. And he sleeps with Caitlin. And Caitlin thinks that this is both of their first times because, like 2 minutes ago when they broke up, after he proposed, Joey was still a virgin too. And this big moment builds up when Snake, who is now our lovable Principal Simpson, Snake thinks Joey's being just like a total sleazeball, and he confronts him about it. And Snake says, Joey, are you going to tell Caitlin you were effing Tessa Campanelli? And Caitlin overhears this, and she goes, you were effing Tessa Campanelli? Total jaw drop moment. And of course, they use the actual F word. But not only was this the first and only F-bomb in Degrassi history, it was the first F-bomb on primetime TV in Canada. So I'm just saying, like, if the new Degrassi is going to swear, they got a lot to live up to, you know? You were effing Tessa Campanelli. Like, that was some powerful stuff. Now, these aren't official script releases or anything. They're known as sides, and they're just for actors to audition with. So this isn't a confirmation that the show will talk about COVID or even explicitly use foul language, but it's just really fun to spectate about any new news that we get and dive into it. And I think it would be really great to see the realities of our new normal reflected in Degrassi. They also announced filming will begin from July 1st to November 30th, though those dates could really change when the time actually comes. It's likely that they just want the cast to know that those are the times that they'll have to be available, though they might not necessarily be physically shooting the show from July to November, because that is kind of a long time for 10 episodes. And typically the reason Degrassi films in the summer is that most of their actors are in school. And summer typically comes with less roadblocks. There's less weather delays, less holidays. You're not going to deal with like Christmas, Boxing Day, and New Year's and major snowstorms. Though if you live in Canada, you know that that's actually not always the case. But we do know for sure that Degrassi's casting for all series regular roles and looking for Canadians who are 13 to 20 years of age. They're casting all ethnicities and all experience levels when it comes to acting. And that's a pretty big deal. And to find out why, it's time we go through our checklist of what the new Degrassi needs to authentically be Degrassi. Now that Degrassi is getting another series, it's really important that we talk about the aspects of Degrassi that are consistent, that really hold true to the brand Degrassi. Because Lara and Julia didn't just pitch a new teen TV show, they pitched a Degrassi reboot, and that has to mean something. There was a statement released by Wildbrain that said, Lara and Julia have envisioned an evolution for Degrassi that, while staying true to the fundamental honesty of the brand, promises fans a journey into new and exciting territory. And that makes me excited. I think because Degrassi has these fundamental rules that they follow, it's a show that can be rebranded over and over again, keeping up with the new world teenagers find themselves in every few years. And it shows that Degrassi's formula works because they successfully revamped the show over and over and over again. Junior High was a new start. Next Gen was a fresh perspective. Season 10 was a game changer for the franchise. Next Class introduced us to Gen Z. So I'm happy to see what Lara and Julia will do to give us a fresh perspective all over again. And the first thing on that checklist for me is casting age appropriate, which is if you're playing a 15-year-old on TV, you're 15 years old in real life, or at least like 14 to 17 and not like 30 years old or something. And we can absolutely check that off our Degrassi checklist because the auditions clearly stated they're casting for 13 to 20-year-old Canadians. Now, with that being said, there's an entire discussion to be had about the ethics and safety of hiring child actors, especially for big plot lines like sexual assault, self-harm, and drug overdoses. But I think that's such a big topic to unpack that it deserves a podcast episode entirely on its own. But for now, it is a Degrassi staple. Being able to see kids who look just like you going through the issues you're going through can make a huge difference on how you relate to that topic. Degrassi might be the only space where anyone's talking to you about sex, talking about drugs, talking about even getting your first period or having your first kiss. And you can relate to that a lot more when the kid going through that is someone who looks just like you. And in saying that, Degrassi also tends not to hire recognizable celebrity actors, unless they're doing like a cameo as an adult or something. They try to hire kids who are just kids. For example, Degrassi Junior High was just a flyer hung up around some schools. To the actors, it was more like a fun summer camp than a big TV show. The creator, Linda Schuyler, said, if you hire a 25-year-old, you're hiring someone with 25 years of life experience. And Degrassi's big thing is representing an authentic teen experience. If you're 15, you only have 15 years of life experience to bring to the show and to bring to your 15-year-old character. And of course, hiring older actors can also mean hiring recognizable actors. Typically at 15, maybe you've done a commercial, maybe you've appeared in another kid's show, but you're probably not coming to Degrassi with a big acting legacy behind you. So our checklist so far is casting age appropriate and casting unknown actors, which is really a staple to the Degrassi brand. The third thing is something known as the adult rule. No two adults could be seen having a private conversation together unless a child is around to overhear it. That ensures that the show is entirely from the teen perspective. Now, of course, you're probably like, Degrassi Kid, that happens literally all the time. Well, the Degrassi Classic cast like Spike, Caitlin, Joey, Snake get a free pass because they were once kids on the show themselves. Sometimes seeing Joey and Caitlin talk about their relationship as adults can be directly connected to conversations they had in the 80s about their relationship as young teenagers. But you would never see like Miss Hatzilakos fighting with her husband if Peter wasn't around to overhear it. Otherwise, it changes the relationship we have with the characters. We then know something they don't. And that's a lot different than when Allie has a secret she doesn't want to tell Claire, or if Wheels is talking about Joey behind his back, because we're fully involved with these teenagers and all the consequences will unfold between them. Like, think about how Adam and Holly J organized Fiona's intervention. We felt on the same page as the characters. They discussed it as two teenagers looking out for someone they cared about. But if we saw Fiona's mom and dad organize it by themselves, having an adult perspective about underage drinking, it would just absolutely change everything. And it would change how we relate to the topic of recognizing when you can step in and help your friend. It would change our perspective on how we trust adults to help us. Like when Paige reached out to Miss Kwan about Ellie, that was far more impactful to me than if a teacher had brought it up to Miss Kwan and discussed how to help Ellie as two adults. Does that make sense? I'm really eager to hear what you guys think of that and if you've noticed that before. Fourth on the list for me, I think, is having standout moments. In my opinion, the new Degrassi will have to match the legacy of what came before it. I'm thinking Manny's abortion, Marco's coming out, Ellie's self-harm, Paige's assault, Spike's pregnancy, Wheels losing his parents, Cam's suicide, the school shooting. These moments in Degrassi are moments that stand out because Degrassi did them best. Degrassi didn't sensationalize these moments that happened in a teenager's life. It wasn't like, dun dun dun, Wheels finds out his parents are dead, Spike's had underage sex and is facing the consequences, right? It was like, hey, here's some real kids who look just like you, who act just like you, and they're going through a tough time just like you, or maybe someone you know. So I think this new Degrassi will really have to tackle some big topics in the same sensitivity that Degrassi's done before. Degrassi is known for bringing in counselors to the writer's room, bringing in educators to the set, sending their writers and actors out for research to meet professionals and real life people going through these topics. Episodes like Ellie's self-harm and Cam's suicide are done with a sensitivity that's planned out seasons in advance, with a sense of awareness that the copycat effect can take place and become harmful, just like with shows like 13 Reasons Why. And for this new Degrassi to really feel like Degrassi, I think they'll have to deliver some big, memorable moments. But I want to hear from you. What do you think that is in 2022? Degrassi's great at reflecting the times as they happen. They tackled the AIDS crisis in the 80s. Abortion rights were changing in the early 2000s. There was a new understanding of trans and queer communities in the 2010s. So I want to know what you think. What topics do you think the new Degrassi needs to truly reflect the times as we're in them? COVID is probably the biggest one I can think of, but I want to know what you think. What's this big story that will stand out if Degrassi tackles it? Or even better, is there anything you'd put on your Degrassi checklist? What does the new Degrassi need to truly be considered Degrassi to you? And honestly, that perfectly brings me into my next topic, which is, what does the new Degrassi need to be even better than any Degrassi that came before it? Because they're saying, like, hey, we're going to make the same old Degrassi you love, but we're going to do it with a new perspective. So what does that mean? And for me, I think the biggest thing is diversity. Degrassi was ahead of its time as it was airing, but retrospectively, we can see that there's room to grow in terms of diverse representation. They had queer characters, they had disabled characters, they had Black characters, but for the most part, they tended to either write those characters off into a Degrassi black hole, or they became side characters. Degrassi had characters in wheelchairs, for example, Maya Goldberg, Nadia Ymir, Jimmy's physiotherapist Trina, Maya Matlin's mom were all wheelchair users, but all of those characters never had their own storylines. They were always with someone who had storylines. And of course, we had Jimmy Brooks, who was played by Drake, and Tristan, who became disabled through different tragedies, which is still a very important story to tell, but I think it would mean a lot for representation and all kids to see themselves in Degrassi if they explored more than just able-bodied teenagers who became wheelchair users. For example, Anya has dyslexia for like one episode. Caitlin has epilepsy, and we never really hear about it again. Liberty's dyscalculia, where did that go? I want to see a kid who shows up to Degrassi in a wheelchair and is bad at math. I want to see a neurodiverse student whose biggest worry is that a big English test and basketball tryouts are on the same day. I want to see representation that exists as more than just taking a neurodivergence and slapping it onto a character for one episode. And I think seeing that kind of diverse representation in kids will be a big deal to teenagers that tune into the show for the very first time, and I think they'll have the same experience as I did as a white queer kid watching Degrassi who could say, I see me in this TV show. And I think the same goes with race. Hazel was always a best friend to Paige. Marisol was a best friend to Katie. Shantae was a best friend to Holly J. And we did have main characters like Lucy and Liberty who were Black, and they all became staples, but that pales in comparison to our leading white women. Caitlin, Spike, Emma, Claire, Maya, Holly J, Paige, Frankie, Jenna. Like, Degrassi loves a white female lead, right? So now I feel super represented, but I think Degrassi could do even better to reflect a better experience for all teenagers when it comes to racial diversity. Now, Next Class, I will say, did do way better at these things. They had more racial and queer diversity than any series before it, even having gay characters where being gay wasn't their only personality trait, or they didn't come to the show and then come out of the closet, right? Next Class had non-binary characters, gay characters, lesbian characters, bi characters, straight characters, but I think they had so much less production support during that transition into Netflix that they weren't able to live up to their full potential. And that's just my completely my own opinion. I could talk for an hour alone about how I think the transition to Netflix was a negative impact for the Degrassi franchise. So maybe that'll be another podcast episode for another day. But I think that it's great that Degrassi Next Class had this cast stocked of diverse characters, but I just felt they really couldn't do much with these time frames, with these 10 short episodes that were only like 23 minutes long. And I'm hopeful that this new Degrassi series can do that with their longer 1-hour format. And I do want to make a point to say that I was out of high school when Degrassi Next Class was airing, so I was not the intended audience for it. And as much as I will watch every single episode that Degrassi will ever make for the rest of my life, Next Class just wasn't intended to represent my high school experience. So it's very easy for me to critique it and say, oh, it just wasn't done as well as the earlier seasons. And same with this new reboot. I'm going to watch it with my whole heart. But I have no idea what it's like to be a teenager in 2022. And no matter how much of a fan I am, this show isn't being made for me. It's not going to reflect my high school experience no matter what. But I want to stand by that I love all generations of Degrassi, and no matter what, each generation plays a role in this huge history of the show. And the last thing that I think they need is something that connects this reboot to the rest of the series. The Degrassi The Next Generation brought back Spike's baby Emma and former students as teachers and parents and in guest roles. But for this new Degrassi to truly, truly be Degrassi, it really needs to be set in the same universe as the ones that came before it. And for me, that doesn't necessarily have to be a baby like it was with Emma. It doesn't need to be Emma's little brother Jack or Casey and Jenna's baby Tyson or JT and Liberty's kid. It just needs to be something that ties the generations together in a way that makes sense and honors the franchise. And I think it would be just such a loss of the 40-year history of the show to have this new generation come in that doesn't really relate to all the stories that came before that. And with that, for Degrassi to be Degrassi, we need some cameos. The same way Spike, Caitlin, Joey, Snake, Wheels, Lucy, Mr. Raditch, and so many other former characters appeared in the 2001 reboot, we need to see some cameos this time around. Get me Principal Simpson as the director of the school board. Get me Spinner as the owner of the Dot. Get me Maya as a music teacher. I think bringing back characters we've loved as series regulars or guest roles will really make Degrassi feel like Degrassi. And I think that perfectly segues us into the next thing I want to talk about, what we don't know. We talked about what we know for sure. We talked about what we think should happen, but what about what we don't know? What questions do we have about the new Degrassi that are still unanswered? The first question for me is, who's going to be on the new Degrassi? We know the auditions were posted, but we don't know who's been selected or who will be coming back to the series. And in my opinion, if they want a big fan reaction, it would be good for them to bring back fan favorites and any actors who went on to make a buzz for themselves after Degrassi. Like if you watch the new Degrassi and Eli and Claire popped up on your screen, you would absolutely freak out. Twitter would go insane. And I think it'd be such a missed opportunity not to bring that couple back. Or Raymond Ablack, who played Sav Bandari. He's made quite a staple for himself, being this heartthrob on Ginny and Georgia and appearing in other shows. And of course, it always depends on who wants to come back, how they fit into the story, if they want to do just a cameo or did they want to have a series role, what does the show allow for, and of course, all of us want our favorite characters to make an appearance. I absolutely want Fiona to come back, but we need to make room for a new cast, I guess. There's also been speculation where Drake is an executive producer on Euphoria, if he might make an appearance. But honestly, that's just a fan reaction and nothing's even been confirmed or discussed about it. But when you look at the press release, there's a summary for the new Degrassi, and I'm going to read it for you. It says, a reprise of the original teen drama, Degrassi is a character-driven series about the high school experience and the thrilling, often painful journey of self-discovery. Set in Toronto, the new series explores a group of teenagers and school faculty living in the shadows of events that both bind them together and tear them apart. The show travels deep into the hearts and homes of diverse, complicated characters as they struggle to find their new normal, reaching for hope, redemption, and love. Okay, we love the mention of diverse characters. We get a confirmation that it's set in Toronto, so that's perfect. But what a lot of fans have noticed is the inclusion of the phrase, it'll focus on teenagers and school faculty. Knowing what we know about the history of Degrassi, they don't tend to focus on adults, right? Unless those adults are former students on the show. So that might be a little clue that we'll get some cameos there. As well, the phrase struggle to find their new normal, that's very much a COVID phrase. We saw COVID mentioned on the audition sides, and I think this just confirms it, for me anyway, that the new Degrassi will cover COVID, which I'm really excited about because I have no experience in how COVID impacted high school, and I think that'll make a lot of kids feel seen and heard if they actually truly authentically tackle it. And the next thing I have to wonder is, how will the 1 hour format change the tone of the show? Lara and Julia have said in a statement that what excites them the most is turning it into a truly serialized 1 hour drama, saying that they're honored to bring this iconic series back into people's homes and lead the evolution of a new Degrassi. So what does that mean? What is 1 hour going to do, and why is that so different? Degrassi's had 1 hour stories before, but they were broken into 2-part episodes, or they've had movies that can be broken down into 4-part episodes. But we've never really had a Degrassi that's just a continuous hour of uninterrupted television. Maybe the School Is Out movie, but I think it'll be interesting because even some of our biggest and best 2-parters like Erica and Manny's abortion, Cam's suicide, the school shooting, I want to know, how would those stories be treated differently if they were an hour long with no breaks? Because ultimately, Degrassi has to build up part 1 to kind of a resolution for that episode. And I think they do really well at getting us back into the action of the emotion in the second episode, But ultimately, it is 2 different episodes, and each with their own setups, each with their own pacing, and their own commercial breaks. So if Degrassi doesn't have to take breaks, how does that change the story? For example, in Manny's abortion episode, it ends with a bit of hope. Craig, who's the father, is excited about the possibility of having his own family, and then part 2 starts off with them happily canoodling in the hallway. Now quickly, Degrassi does get us back into the realities of the situation that a 14-year-old girl who is pregnant has to make a really big decision. And ultimately she does. She decides to have an abortion. But if Manny's abortion episode was 60 full minutes, would that moment of hope look any different? Would it have a different point in the story? Would we have more time with her in the abortion clinic? Would we have more time with her immediately after the abortion, maybe the next day at school? I could ask 100,000 questions about this, but ultimately I want to know, how does 1 hour truly change Degrassi? And I'm just very excited to find out. My last question for the new Degrassi is, how will they live up to the precedents Degrassi has set around fan interaction? And does that matter to them at all? Because in the 80s, they started doing mall tours and meet and greets. In the 2000s, they made a website, Degrassi.tv, where you could personalize your own locker pages and chat with the characters. And in 2010, they made Twitter accounts for all of their characters. They had viewing parties at Much Music. They started doing Snapchat takeovers and Google Hangouts. And the show had a fan base that would come together weekly on Tumblr and Twitter to talk about and promote the show. But with Degrassi Next Class, I don't know if you guys will remember this, but the Canadian air date and the American air date were completely different. Season 1 of Next Class aired weekly in Canada on the Family Channel, and then when it was all done, it got all uploaded to Netflix for the Americans. So when that happened, I didn't talk about Degrassi on the internet when it was airing. And, I'm Degrassi Kid. You know what I mean? So I didn't want to lose any of my American followers by spoiling the series for them. And then when you're binge watching it, you're all at different pacing in the story. And just with the loss of funding, the rushed production, the divide in air times, Degrassi Next Class, the Degrassi fan community just stopped being interactive with Degrassi. And I want to know how the new Degrassi will combat that. HBO Max airs shows of Euphoria weekly, and the fan engagement is insane. I haven't seen a single episode of the show. I don't know if I should admit that, but I haven't. I know just from my Twitter feed that Sundays were Euphoria days, and I could probably recite the entire series to you just because I read live tweets from the Euphoria fan community every single week. So I'm eager for them to confirm the show will air on Crave at the same time it airs on HBO Max in a weekly format, because if they do that, hopefully it'll bring the fan base back together, because we found out that dividing the fan base just doesn't work. Other than that, I think that kind of brings us to the fan reaction of the reboot. We have all of this information and we have all of these unanswered questions. So what do the people who love this show and love this franchise have to say about a new effing reboot? Oh my god. Ultimately, I think everyone is excited, but at very, very first, there was a lot of fear around the announcement, because as exciting as it is to have your favorite show come back to life, it is something that you want to protect and take care of, and you want it to be done well. And we all want to make sure that if Degrassi comes back, it comes back in good hands. Hearing that Linda and Steven were involved, hearing that it was picked up by an American network, and picked up by an American network that ran other popular teen shows like Euphoria, those were all initial parts of the announcement that had the fandom kind of on edge about the reboot. But then, after some information got released, after we learned who the showrunners were, verifying that it'd be a Canadian series, it's still in the family category, it really helped keep our peace of mind that the show will be taken care of. But it is fun to theorize on who's going to come back. What will they talk about? What's the new set going to look like? And all of these different fan speculations that we've had so far. As well, it was really exciting to see the actors react to the reboot. A lot of actors were saying, hey, if you need a drama teacher, if you need a guidance counselor, I will gladly come back. I mean, we heard from Paige, Sean, Spinner, Jay, Joey Jeremiah, Frankie Hollingsworth, all sorts of former Degrassi actors willing to come back to their most famous roles. And that covers it. That's the bulk of what we know, what we can expect, and what we're excited for. And a lot of that is honestly just my opinion. I can sit here and say, well, to be Degrassi, they have to do this. But really, they can do whatever they want. It's their show, and I completely trust them with it. I'm excited to see how they bring in new viewership while also giving throwbacks to the legacy that came before it. And most of all, I'm excited to hear how I did for my first Degrassi podcast. Let me honestly know. And while you're at it, subscribe to my Patreon page to help support future episodes of the Degrassi Kid podcast and gain access to behind the scenes content. If we can get enough support, then maybe there will be a second episode and maybe there will be some guest stars. So check out my Patreon page if you can. But for now, thank you guys so much for spending a little bit of time with me to hang out on the new Degrassi Kid podcast. Thanks, guys.